going through all this material on elder abuse. I got to say, pretty heavy stuff, but so important.
Oh, yeah.
And you being a nurse assistant and all, you've probably seen some of this firsthand, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know, taking this deep dive into it, it's really eye-opening.
Absolutely. It's one thing to know, like, okay, yeah, elder abuse exists, but to really get it, the different types of abuse and how it can kind of sneak up on you, that's when things get really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It's not always, like, so obvious. Not some big traumatic event. Sometimes it's these, like, little things.
Exactly. That's why this focus on the nurse assistant's perspective, I think it's so important. You're often the first line of defense for these vulnerable adults. You see them day in and day out, build relationships, notice those little changes that others might miss.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going beyond just, like, the definitions and types of abuse. We're going to really try to get into, like, the psychology of it all. Explore those gray areas, give you a framework for not just recognizing and reporting, but for understanding the deeper dynamics.
Yeah, totally. We'll even, give you some strategies for prevention. Because sometimes the best way to fight abuse is to stop it before it even starts.
That's what I like to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with, the basics. What even is elder abuse? This source defines it as any intentional act, or even just not doing something, failure to act that causes harm or puts an older adult, 60 or older, at risk of harm.
Right, and it's not just like physical violence or anything. It's a whole spectrum. Emotional, psychological, financial, even sexual abuse.
No, it's a lot,
Yeah.
And it often targets, like, individuals
Right.
who are already vulnerable, right? Because of age-related changes, health conditions, people who might be dependent on others for care.
Making them easy targets. Exactly. Think of someone like struggling with dementia. They might be easily confused, manipulated, especially if they're relying on a caregiver who's not, acting in their best interest.
Oh, man. That's just heartbreaking. It's like a total betrayal of trust. So let's break down these types of abuse. The source mentions verbal, physical, psychological. It's a pretty long list.
It is, and each type can have, like, really bad consequences. Take psychological abuse, for example. Imagine you're an older adult, right? And your caregiver is constantly, like, putting you down, telling you you're worthless, a burden. That emotional abuse, it can really mess you up, make you feel totally powerless.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that. It's not just physical scars, right? It's about, like, the emotional wounds, and those could be just as bad, if not worse.
Exactly. And then there's neglect, which people don't always think about that. It might not seem as, like, active as other forms of abuse, but the impact can be just as severe. The source gives the example of ignoring call lights, like someone's calling for help, and you just ignore them. It might seem small, but if that happens over and over, it can lead to, feelings of isolation, fear, even physical harm if their needs aren't met.
Wow. That's a really good example. It shows how even those, like, little things, those acts of omission can be abused. Okay, what about financial abuse? I feel like that's becoming more and more common.
Right.
Especially with seniors who, might be more trusting or less tech savvy.
Yeah, you're right. Financial abuse can be really sneaky because it often preys on that trust. The source gives some classic examples, like stealing money or personal belongings. But it can be more, like, complicated, too, like coercing an older adult into changing their will or signing over a power of attorney.
So it's not always as, like, blatant as someone emptying a bank account. It can be more like manipulating someone.
Yeah, exactly. And because money stuff can be, like, complicated and sensitive, it can be hard for victims to even realize what's happening.
Right. And then there's healthcare fraud, which is just, I was reading about some of the examples, like billing for services that never happened or overcharging for medications. It's crazy to think that people would do that.
Yeah, it is. What's really messed up about healthcare fraud is it often targets people who are already dealing with health issues, and they might not be able to, like, fully understand or challenge these fraudulent activities.
Right, like a double whammy. They're dealing with health problems.
Yeah.
And then they're being taken advantage of financially.
It goes against everything healthcare should be about. Care and compassion.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types of abuse, but how do we, like, actually recognize it? What are some of the signs that should make us think, hold on, something's not right?
That's a great question. The source gives a lot of red flags. But you got to remember, context is everything. Not every bruise means physical abuse, and not every withdrawn senior is being psychologically abused. You got to look at the bigger picture.
Right. So it's not about like jumping to conclusions based on one thing. It's more about like patterns of behavior, right? Changes in how someone's acting.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You've been working with a resident, and they're always, happy and chatty. And then all of a sudden, they become withdrawn, stop doing the things they used to enjoy, and seem scared around their caregiver. That's a big change, That should definitely raise concerns.
That makes sense. Like noticing those subtle shifts, that might mean something's wrong. Now, the source also mentions like physical signs, like unexplained bruises or injuries.
Yeah, but again, it's all about context. An older adult might bruise more easily, because their skin is thinner, or they're on certain medications. The key is patterns. Are the bruises in places that are easy to hide? Do the explanations for the injuries make sense? Those are the things to pay attention to.
So it's not just like seeing a bruise and assuming the worst. It's about asking questions, getting information, and trusting your gut if something seems off.
Exactly, and that's where the nurse assistant is so important. You're the ones who spend the most time with these folks. You see what's going on. You can pick up on those cues.
So it's not just about physical care. It's about being like an advocate. A protector.
Exactly. And in the next part, we'll talk more about that, what you can do if you suspect abuse is happening.
Wow. It's a lot to think about, The responsibility that comes with being a nurse assistant. It's not just like, taking care of someone's physical needs. You're really like in a position to protect their well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And that responsibility, it goes beyond just, recognizing the signs of abuse. It's also about understanding, like, your legal and ethical obligations as a mandated reporter.
Right. The source talked a lot about that.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit? What does it mean to be a mandated reporter?
Sure. Basically, it means if you think elder abuse is happening, you have to report it. It's not a choice. It's the law.
So there's no like, wait and see. You see something. You say something.
Exactly. The law, it recognizes how vulnerable older adults are. And it puts a responsibility on certain professionals, like nurse assistants.
Yeah.
To be their advocate.
Yeah.
To protect them.
And I imagine there are, like, consequences if you don't report suspected abuse.
Yeah, definitely. You could get in trouble legally, like fines, or even lose your license. But it's more than that, It's an ethical thing. We're talking about people who might not be able to protect themselves. And if you don't say anything, it could be really bad for them.
It's not just about, saving your own skin. It's about doing the right thing, living up to the trust people have in you as a caregiver.
Right. I know reporting can seem scary, but the source lays out some pretty clear steps. First thing, most important thing, tell a licensed nurse or your supervisor. Let them know what's going on.
So you don't have to, like, figure it all out on your own. You're part of a team, and there's a process for this.
Exactly. And beyond your team, there are also outside resources, like adult protective services and the long-term care ombudsman. They're there to investigate these situations and make sure the person gets the help they need.
So even if you're feeling like unsure or overwhelmed, you don't have to handle it all by yourself.
Nope. There are people who can help.
That's good to know. Now, I noticed the source also mentioned patient rights violations. What does that mean exactly when we're talking about elder abuse?
Good question. Elder abuse, a lot of times.
Wow.
It goes along with violations of patient rights. These are like basic rights that everyone has to make sure they get treated with dignity and respect, no matter how old they are or what their health is like. And denying someone those rights, that's a form of abuse in itself.
So things like the right to privacy, the right to refuse treatment, the right to make their own decisions about their care.
Yeah, exactly. The source specifically talks about the right to be free from restraints, the right to be informed about their care, and the right to complain without being afraid of retaliation.
So if you see a colleague, like talking down to a resident, or if you notice someone's being isolated, those could be signs of patient rights violations.
Yeah, definitely. And those violations, they need to be taken just as seriously as any other kind of abuse.
And the reporting process is the same, right?
Yeah.
Tell a nurse, follow your agency's procedures.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone feels safe.
Yeah.
And everyone's rights are respected.
This whole deep dive, it's really showing me how, like, elder abuse is so multi-layered. It's not just about, one bad person. It's about systems, power dynamics, societal attitudes.
Yeah, you're right.
All these things that contribute to the problem.
And, it's important to remember the caregivers are often working in systems that are really stressful. The source even talked about self-care for caregivers.
It did. It said that caregiver burnout can actually lead to neglect or even abusive behaviors. It's kind of like a paradox, right?
Yeah.
You got to take care of yourself to be able to take care of others.
Exactly. Like that thing they say on airplanes. Put your own oxygen mask on first before you help anyone else. And in this case, self-care isn't selfish. It's actually essential.
So what are some things caregivers can do to prioritize their own well-being?
The source mentioned things like setting boundaries, asking for help from colleagues or family, taking breaks, doing things that help them relax like exercise or meditation.
It's like they say, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
You got to take care of yourself to be able to give your best to others.
And it's important to recognize those early signs of burnout, feeling overwhelmed, drained, cynical. Those are signs that you need to step back and recharge.
Be proactive, right? Don't wait till you're completely burnt out.
And create a work environment where self-care is seen as important, not as something extra.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because ultimately, preventing elder abuse, it's not just about one person doing the right thing. It's about creating a system where everyone feels empowered to speak up, where caregivers are valued and older adults feel safe.
It's about moving from, reacting to abuse to preventing it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And in the last part of our deep dive, we'll talk more about those prevention strategies and leave you with some things to think about.
It's been really great talking about all of this with you. I feel like we've really gotten a good understanding of, elder abuse. It's complicated, but we've also talked about some things we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's really stood out to me is this focus on prevention. We can't just wait for abuse to happen and then react. We need to be proactive, create environments where it's less likely to happen.
Right. So let's talk about that. The source mentioned a few strategies. One that I thought was really interesting was fostering a culture of respect for older adults. It sounds, I don't know, kind of simple, but I think it's really important.
It is. And it starts with, challenging those stereotypes about aging. The ones that make people think older adults are less valuable or that they're a burden. We need to recognize and appreciate everything they do for their families, their communities, society as a whole.
So it's about changing how we think about aging, seeing older adults as, assets, not problems to be dealt with.
Exactly. And that respect should be everywhere, the way we talk to them, the way we design our communities, the way we support them.
It's about making sure older adults feel valued, included, empowered.
Right. And that empowerment is really important for prevention.
How so?
Well, when older adults know their rights and they have access to resources and support, they're less likely to become victims.
So it's not just about protecting them, it's about giving them the tools to protect themselves.
Exactly. And the source also talked about supporting caregivers.
Yeah, that's important.
It is. We talked about self-care. But it goes beyond that, Caregivers need training, resources, help with taking breaks so they don't get burnt out and so they can give the best care possible.
It's about recognizing that caregivers, they're like the front line in all of this, and they need support too.
Absolutely. And that support can look like a lot of things, fair pay, flexible schedules, access to mental health care, opportunities to learn and grow professionally.
It's about investing in caregivers,
right?
Recognizing how important their work is.
And that investment, it benefits everyone, not just caregivers, but the older adults they care for.
So as we wrap up, I'm feeling, kind of hopeful. Elder abuse is a serious issue, but there are things we can do.
Yeah, I agree. We've covered a lot today.
We have.
But this is just the beginning, Keep learning, keep talking about this. Talk to your colleagues, your family, your community leaders. Advocate for change.
It's on all of us, right, to protect older adults.
It is. So as we finish up, I want you to think about this. Imagine a world where older adults are not only safe from abuse, but where they're truly valued and respected, where they can live their lives to the fullest. That's the world we should be working towards, and I believe we can get there.
That's a great vision. And it reminds me that, this deep dive, it wasn't just about learning about elder abuse. It was about, figuring out what we can do about it. So thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time.